Okay, today I want to chat a bit about Chinese coffee. I have Bill here, and what we just want to go over is how did Chinese coffee get to where it is today? What are the trends we've observed? And also kind of discuss, has Chinese coffee caught up? Like, what is the current state of Chinese coffee? I've really seen a growth in the amount of producers and also roasters, at least here in the United States, carrying Chinese coffees. It's one of these coffees where I have seen it just actively get better every single year. And I think this year is finally one that I think it's just really exploded. And we see a lot of adoption of things like advanced processing techniques and all of that. But before we chat a bit about that, let's first of all do a quick intro, Bill, and then we'll kind of go over the history of Chinese coffee.
Hello, I'm Bill. I run Hydrangea. I think everyone's moderately familiar with me. I run some funny processed coffee, really tasty processed coffee. That's kind of what I'm into. So I'm here to talk about some coffee from Yunnan. Of course, I think most people know I am Chinese, so I have a special feeling for Chinese coffee. So Chinese coffee originated in Yunnan when the French missionary brought it over in the 1800s. Because the French wants coffee in China, they want it locally, so they bought the plant over. So that's how coffee originally started. There are two main growing regions in China. One is in Yunnan. Yunnan is the more tropical, more mountainous area. And then there's also Hainan, which has weather closer to Hawaii. So Hainan mostly plants Robusta and mostly feeds the commercial chain. That's not what we're interested in today because that's the slightly lower tier. And then Yunnan constitutes about 90 to 95% of total coffee population in China. And then during the Cold War especially, Chinese coffee had its first boom in terms of producing because the Russian wants coffee, and then China being an ally of Russia, and because it's impossible to plant coffee in Russia being a tropical fruit, so Russia demands China to plant a lot of coffee for them. Shocking. So that's how Chinese coffee got started. And then later in the 21st century, coffee has become more and more of a commodity in China. So the growing demand has driven coffee producing back up with brands like Luckin Coffee, with brands like Starbucks helping local coffee. So that's how the coffee scene has gotten bigger and bigger. So that's the really brief summary of Chinese coffee.
There's a very interesting cultural shift, especially with, I feel like the younger generations, people around their 20s and 30s now, actually drinking coffee in China. To no one's surprise, I think most people know that tea is very popular in China, right. But it's very interesting to see now, at least with the adoption of specialty coffee and even some specialty coffee brands penetrating the market in China. You look at like brands like Blue Bottle. Right. It's like the fact that there are lines at a Blue Bottle is it's insane because you look at here in the States and you're like, well, yeah, I have seen lines at Blue Bottle, but like people aren't trying to knock on the door and like hang out and wait an hour to get coffee. And I think the culture is just very different over there. And I think people, at least in their 20s and 30s now, are just very they're invested in coffee. I think also a lot of Chinese, a lot of Asian culture is also focusing a lot on, I would say, like premium, higher end stuff. And that kind of naturally has fallen into coffee. I feel like the focus on flavors and all that has been elevated to an extent. And I think it's a very interesting change. And this is something that has now kind of made its way to here, at least some of those higher end Chinese coffees. I think if you have never tasted Chinese coffee, like a Yunnan coffee, it's very worthwhile exploring because you should kind of have an open mind and try tasting what these guys across the world are tasting.
So Yunnan coffee started off more from here, more like people use Yunnan coffee more as commodity coffee. They use it in different blends. They use it in dark roast because it's cheap, and coffee is slightly higher than market price, whatever they were growing in Yunnan versus other crops. So it was more profitable for farmers, so farmers leaned more into it. And then when later it becomes slightly unprofitable as the coffee market crashed, less and less people started planting it until the demand has driven them back up. So most of the Yunnan stuff is not super specialty grade. It's around 77 points, 76 points on a Q grader scale. So to be specialty, the scores is right around like 80. So people wanted to bring coffee to that higher quality. There's more coffee driven. I think Torch especially has done a lot of work. They bought farmers from Guatemala, they bought farmers from Honduras to teach farmers in Yunnan on how to practice better farming techniques. For example, planting shade trees in between farms. For example, only harvesting ripe cherry, identifying when cherry is ripe and harvesting at the right time, and make sure the trees are properly fed, fed with the right nutrient. That finally brought coffee over to the 80, 81 points. And on top of that, so Yunnan's coffee is not particularly high elevation. So the terroir is actually really interesting. So Yunnan is very tropical. It is very mountainous. The tallest mountain goes over 4,000 meters in elevation easily. But we see Yunnan coffee and we see elevation in like the 1500s, the 1600s, right? And then there is this correlation generally. This is not true for every coffee, but there is this correlation between higher elevation correlates to higher quality coffee. So you ask, why don't farmers just simply plant higher? So yeah, that's the problem with the terroir. It is not the best terroir for coffee. At some point, when you reach 1800, when you reach 1900, you start reaching the frost zone, and then the frost start killing off the plants. So the farmer has made an attempt to plant a little bit higher, but they really cannot. So you really have the 1500, 1600 terroir to work with. So you cannot plant your geishas. It's really, really difficult to plant your geishas, your pacamaras, your cedras out there. So 95% of Yunnan primarily plants a varietal called Catimor. Catimor is a hybrid of Caturra and Timor. And Timor has Robusta genetics, so it's more resistant to disease. It's easier to plant, it's et cetera, all the benefits. But the trade-off is it tastes less good because Catimor is a quarter Robusta.
Yeah, so it's bitter.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is, for example, a coffee that you will get, let's say 5-10 years ago from a typical Yunnan origin. It may or may not be perfectly harvested. It might be full of Quakers. It might be full of, there's a lot of problems with it. So it doesn't taste all that good. You get lots of chocolate. You get lots of nut. You get lots of like wheatgrass. All these are not notes we're chasing for in this specialty coffee world.
Yeah.
In the specialty
in
world.
what we are currently, if you're accustomed to the Western version of specialty, right? Like,
Right.
Those are flavors that you might not like.
We currently have the constraint of we primarily plant Catimors. We cannot plant really exotic varietals out there because coffee takes a while for it to harvest. Usually ripes its first cherry within 3 years and really start producing within like 6-7 years. So it's a lot of risk for farmers to just take out their Catimor that's currently growing really well and plant something new.
Yeah.
So that was a huge risk. And then their terroir is not going to improve anytime soon because they plant low elevation and plus global warming. So they're like, oh, we want our coffee to taste better. So they turn to processing. So they're like, oh, we're going to try something. So this introduced the modern coffee, the modern Yunnan coffee. So this is a anaerobic yeast wash coffee. So for this particular coffee, I think coffee got pumped in a plastic tank and filled with water, and then they added coffee-specific yeast to it, and then they injected carbon dioxide. Very similar to winemaking, like very similar to how you make a Riesling or how you make a Sauvignon Blanc, or you let it ferment for about 70 to 150 hours, and then you drain all the water, and then you do a traditional wash process on it. During this time, the yeast breaks down the mucilage and the sugar in the coffee, and then it macerates into it. So it increases a little bit of sweetness, it increases a little bit of clarity. So whereas this is traditionally different than like a traditional anaerobic wash, right? Is that they're limiting the fermentation by injecting carbon dioxide, right? This limited the amount of oxygen they have. So lesser quote unquote funk flavor has been produced. So it's still a relatively very clean coffee. So this leads to the next point. So this coffee actually tastes surprisingly close to one of my favorite producers, Diego Bermudez's coffee. It is different because the terroir is different, the varietal is different, everything else is different. But it has notes reminiscent of Diego Bermudez, like peach rings, like strawberry candy, that kind of stuff.
And this is kind of where we want to just chat a bit about, has Chinese coffee caught up, right? It's like they've gotten over this hump of the terroir, right? If you taste like a lot of washed coffees from Yunnan, right? If you are a Western specialty coffee enjoyer, you probably are going to be like, oh, this tastes like dirt. It tastes like, it doesn't taste good, to like what you would traditionally like in terms of like acidity and brightness in coffee. And also, even with roasting, I think it's worthwhile mentioning is I think a lot of Chinese roasters, they try to combat this by roasting darker, right? It's like you just like cover it up somehow, and you end up with like chocolate and a lot of those darker flavors, which again, like I want to respect, right? It's like these are things that people in China probably really like, right? It's like you might not like it because you live in the U.S. or you live in the West, right? You might not like those flavors because that is what your palate is accustomed to. But like they roast for their market, they source coffee for their those types of their customers, and like these are things that are completely different than what you might be used to. But it's interesting to see kind of a shift in the past few years, or maybe not a complete shift, but like the possibility that these producers are producing coffee that can actually match a Western flavor profile. And I feel like I've tasted a lot of Chinese coffees, and a lot of them are like anaerobic natural. They're trying to cover up the Catimor taste, the terroir, whatever the taste of the Chinese soil is, right? They're trying to cover it up with the processing. And a lot of the times it's like just not that good, if I were to put my Western hat on. But now, kind of in the past few months, and really the past year, we've seen coffees like this come out, which is insane, because you taste something like this and you're like, that doesn't taste like a Chinese coffee. That doesn't taste like what you envision the Chinese coffee to taste like. It tastes like, some fancy Colombian coffee. I think that's really interesting. It's like, they've gotten to this point this fast. This is a Catimor from Yunnan. When I first had this coffee, like Bill had a version of this coffee. I was like, is this Letty? It's like, no, it's not Letty. Letty Bermudez by Diego Bermudez. And you're like, what, you're confused. That coffee to me is such a stellar thing in my mind. This is very, very similar. I think this does kind of pose the question of, are these guys copying, right?
Right.
Are these producers copying someone like Diego Bermudez? And is that even, is that bad?
Difficult to
It's
answer.
a very difficult thing to
It's
answer,
a difficult question to answer, right?
Yeah.
Diego Bermudez is not entirely clear about whatever tech he's using. I think the Chinese producer is also not very clear.
Yeah.
So this is still a very gray area.
Yeah, like, I'm not saying this tastes exactly like Letty. It does not taste exactly like it, but it's super similar. You definitely can still tell, though, that the processing can only take it so far.
Right.
When these coffees, in my opinion, really, really cool down, that's when they kind of start to fall apart.
Right.
But when they're hot, when you're actually brewing them and you're tasting them, they hold up pretty well. It's fine. And you're just like, wow, this is crazy. Because you also look at the price of this coffee, and you're like,
right.
It's cheap.
Because the Catimor, at the end of the day, is infinitely easier to plan, and if we can take more innovative processing like yeast wash, like thermal shock, and we can apply it to emergent origins, that will be great for the farmers. And yeah, not everything has to be terroir.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, that's, what processing is. It's fascinating to see the adoption of some of these techniques in just such a short period of time, and we just end up with a better coffee. Now, is this something that I think Chinese people will like? I don't know. Possibly, but I think this is something that a lot of Western people would be very interested in trying. You did have a coffee like this in 2020?
In 2020, during COVID, my parents bought me some coffee back from China, including one roasters I really like. So he's like, here's a Yunnan you have to try. And then he bought me this coffee that tasted like mango, tasted a lot like lots of yellow fruit. And that was mind blown. And then, so I've been trying to source that coffee ever since in the Western states.
Yeah, I mean, it also sounds like, roasters and producers in China are excited about this. You might have seen this coffee actually picked up by a few different roasters, this specific Yunnan, which is pretty awesome. But we just have the glitch roast of this. We're gonna brew some of this coffee up. We did have some other coffees, but I thought this one was the most interesting. Yeast fermentation honey, tasting notes: lychee, mangosteen, aloe, peach, loquat, soda, citrus finish, juicy. And this is only a 1,400 meter coffee. This is, low elevation. I'm just gonna generalize here, but you see some of those flavor notes in like 1900 plus, the real, real Panama geishas stuff. We're gonna open up and give it a smell real quick. Yeah, you just smell this and it's like, it smells nice. it smells very pleasant, but it has that extra layer, and you're smelling it, you're like, hey, wait a second, that kind of smells like maybe a Diego coffee, which is kind of goofy, you're like,
the
whoa.
same set of florality, the same set of like really sweetness that comes through from Diego coffee.
We've done too much cupping, so we're switching to brewing now. Jeez. Here's what I'm picking up on this is that, yes, it is, you smell that processing, you get a lot of that florality, but there's something at the end that is like, you can tell that it is not like all there, right? It's like the terroir, that's the Catimor that I'm smelling. It also has that perfumey effect, like you grind some Diego Bermudez coffees and the whole room smells like that. That's what this room smells like, right? It smells like this coffee, and it's just wild to have this, considering where this is from, right? It's like, it's just very unexpected. Yeah, smell that, like, it just it's like that type of reaction is like the first reaction that I had when I brewed a Bermudez coffee was that exact reaction. It was like, what is happening? Where are we getting these aromas from? You could let most people smell this and you tell them this is a coffee from China. I don't think anybody, like,
It'll be a difficult. It will be difficult to guess.
When I ground it, the dry dose, I could tell like something slightly off just right at the end where you're like, okay, you're smelling the processing most of the time, but like brewing, this is all just like that processing that we're smelling, which is filling this entire room. It's super floral. Smells great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, right.
There's acidity in this, right? Like
really pleasant acidity.
Very pleasant acidity, and it's super sweet. Wow.
The finish is a little bit not super clean. It's a little bit wheatgrass.
Yeah, like that's the thing with these is that 90% of what you're experiencing, I would say, is great. And then you can then taste just a little bit of that Catimor, right?
Yeah.
That is what's happening here. But if you're not paying attention to this, you'll just be like, that's great. And this is something that I find to be very fascinating with this, is that like, yes, this is the purpose of processing, right? Is to elevate everything. And what you're experiencing with this coffee is all the processing. And it's quite nice, right? I mean, obviously, if you guys like clean washed coffees, this is probably not for you. But like, this is really good. Something I've observed across even many, even very deeply processed Chinese coffee is actually a very, very big focus on sweetness. I think this might actually be like an Asian preference where like a lot of people like sweetness. Yes, there's defined acidity in this. Yes, it's like integrated into the brew, but like it's predominantly sweet.
And it's definitely one of the emerging origins that's on the watch and on the rise.
I mean, how many producers are actually doing this, right? This seems quite hard. They are putting a lot of effort. There's a lot of investment in equipment, in space, and I think they have to take a risk on doing these coffees too, and hope they sell, right?
For roasters, it might, for example, for me, right, it might be a risk decision for me to source a Yunnan coffee. For example, because most people see Yunnan, people doesn't really want to buy. So I ended up hoarding this coffee, eventually becomes old crop and ended up losing money on it. So this is why it might take another couple years for Yunnan coffee to start hitting more and more shelves, because once people realize that, oh, this is actually decent.
Yeah.
And this is, people are more willing to try out things they're more and more familiar with, and of course taste good. Yeah, I think taste at the end of the day is really important.
Yeah, and like it's interesting because I'm tasting a coffee like this, and I do feel like it is kind of striking a balance between what I think a lot of the West likes and also what a lot of Asia likes. Like I think when I think about Western coffee, I think about acidity, vibrancy, brightness in coffee. At least, we're talking specialty here. Whereas like when I think about Asian coffee roasting, I think mainly sweetness, rounding, harmony among flavor notes. And it's interesting to see that there are coffees like this that actually strike kind of a balance between the two, right? There is defined acidity in this. There is a lot of sweetness in this. And a lot of that has come out of processing. There's going to be a small group of people who hate this coffee because it's processed, right? It's like, you're not allowed to do that. It's against the rules, right? But at the same time, like I think a lot of people in the industry struggle with like, yes, people like clean stuff, but in like there's an emerging market, emerging producers, they're putting in effort, they're investing money and time to elevate the quality of coffee. Look, I think that's good. And I think this is like, it's always like hard to discuss like, is it good or bad, right? Is something like, is processing good or bad? We're not going to discuss that in this video because there's like a lot of minds. We gotta make sure we don't, step on anyone's toes in saying these things, but I'll put my hobbyist perspective on and say, I think this is cool. I think this is really fun. What is kind of our conclusion? Do we think that Chinese coffee is caught up? Are they on the come up?
They're on the rise. They're on the rise. The market will eventually decide whether or not this fits most people's flavor profile.
Yeah.
But it is definitely something on the watch.
I think a lot of things will happen in the next 3 to 5 years. This feels like something that is moving so fast that in the next 2, 3, even 5 years, we should see very big changes. Could be very disruptive for the entire industry, who knows? But the fact that there is a coffee like this that is actually readily available is quite a statement. And I think this is, as a hobbyist, I think you guys should definitely try these coffees out. That's all we want to chat about today is history of Chinese coffee. What is the state of it now, and what are they currently doing, and have they caught up? And we'd be super curious to hear about your guys' thoughts on this. And have you guys tried Chinese coffee? And if not, maybe you should look at some roasters, try some out. But super curious about your guys' thoughts. Thank you guys so much for spending time to watch this video, and always nice to have Bill hang out with us and talk about, he knows a lot of stuff, so he talks a lot. It tells us all the good stuff. But yeah, see you guys around. Hopefully this brew is good.
Yeah.
Just your phone dropping.